For decades, Gene Simmons was the face of control, the man behind the fire, the leather, and the myth of the demon. But at Ace Frehley's tribute, that mask finally cracked. As the crowd fell silent, Gene stepped to the podium, notes in hand, ready to give a short eulogy. What happened next was something no one expected. Halfway through his first sentence, his voice broke. He tried again, out of habit, and this time, he couldn't. He looked down, exhaled, and whispered into the microphone, "I miss my brother." There was no roar, no theatrics, no image to protect, just a man who'd spent half a century beside another and now stood alone. Fans in the room say it was the first time they'd ever seen Gene Simmons cry, and for that moment it didn't matter who he was on stage. It mattered who he was without the makeup. A brother saying goodbye. The tribute to Ace Frehley wasn't a stadium spectacle. It was quiet, intimate, and painfully human. Held in a small Los Angeles theater draped in blue lights, the stage was lined with guitars and candles instead of flames and fireworks. Gene Simmons, known for commanding thousands, was suddenly facing only a few hundred. Friends, family, and lifelong fans gathered to remember the man who made Kiss complete. He'd been asked to deliver one of the final speeches, a symbolic gesture, as if closing a circle that began 50 years ago. For hours, Gene had practiced his words backstage. He'd written about Ace's humor, his chaos, his talent, and how his guitar sounded like thunder wrapped in soul. But when he finally stepped into the light, something shifted. The frontman who once breathed fire now stood frozen in it. He read a few lines, then stopped, his eyes fixed on a photo of Ace smiling in his prime. The paper in his hand trembled. He tried to speak again, but the words came out fractured, small. A single tear ran down his face, catching the stage light like the reflection off a guitar string. For a man who'd built his career on control, that crack in his voice felt louder than any concert could ever be. In that moment, Gene wasn't the demon. He wasn't even Gene Simmons, the legend. He was just a man saying goodbye to the friend who helped him become who he was. When Gene finally found his voice again, the room had gone completely still. No cameras flashing, no murmurs, just silence. He looked out at the crowd, at old bandmates, Ace's family, and fans who'd traveled from across the world, and spoke softly. "We made a lot of noise together, but I didn't say enough when the lights were off." That single sentence changed the entire mood of the night. It wasn't rehearsed. It wasn't polished. It was real. And it came from a place far deeper than nostalgia. Gene went on to describe Ace not as the spaceman, but as the heartbeat of their early years. He said, "Ace brought a kind of chaos that made the music come alive." And then, almost as if speaking to him directly, Gene added, "You drove me crazy. You made me laugh and you made me better. I hope you know that now." People in the audience later said it felt less like a eulogy and more like a confession. A man lifting the weight of decades. There was no mention of fame, tours, or records. Just friendship, regret, and gratitude, all tangled together in one trembling voice. For someone who spent his life building one of rock's biggest brands, Gene's words that night stripped everything back to the core. Because beneath the makeup, the fire, and the myth, there was always a brotherhood. And now, one half of it was gone. Before the fame, before the makeup, before Kiss became a brand that conquered arenas, there were just 4 hungry musicians rehearsing in a New York basement: Paul, Gene, Peter, and Ace. Gene talked about those early days during his tribute, and for a moment, his voice carried a kind of warmth that only memory can give. He recalled how Ace walked into their first audition late, wearing mismatched shoes and carrying a beat-up Les Paul. Everyone laughed until he started to play. Gene said the room lit up, like a fuse had just been lit under rock and roll. That was the day the sound of Kiss was born. He spoke about the long nights driving across state lines in a van, held together with duct tape, eating cold pizza, and dreaming of pyrotechnics they couldn't yet afford. And through every hardship, Ace was the spark, the unpredictable energy that kept the dream alive. "People remember the makeup," Gene said, "but I remember the laughter, the way Ace could make a disaster feel like a good story waiting to happen." For the crowd listening, those stories pulled back the curtain on a band that often seemed larger than life. It wasn't just about fame anymore. It was about the fragile human bond that made that fame possible. And as Gene revisited those moments, it was clear that this wasn't a eulogy for a bandmate. It was a love letter to the beginning of everything. For years, Gene Simmons had kept his emotions locked behind the same armor that built his image. Unshakable, composed, untouchable. But at Ace Frehley's tribute, that wall finally cracked. Friends close to Gene say he'd been carrying the grief privately for weeks. He had stayed quiet through interviews, turning down major TV spots and requests for comment. He didn't want to talk about Ace for headlines. He wanted to process it privately until the night of the tribute forced the past into the spotlight. The moment he began speaking, decades of memories, the laughter, the fights, the stages they burned down together, came flooding back. It wasn't the cameras or the audience that broke him. It was the realization that Ace was really gone, that there would never be another call, another reunion, another chance to say what he should have said years ago. Witnesses said Gene's voice cracked when he mentioned the first time they toured together in 1974. He paused, looked toward the photo of Ace projected behind him, and whispered, "You were the heartbeat, man." Then, for the first time in public memory, he had to step back from the mic. The man who had spent his life breathing fire couldn't breathe at all. And in that silence, the audience saw something they never expected from the demon. They saw Gene Simmons, the brother, the friend, the man left behind. When the video of Gene Simmons breaking down hit the internet, it spread faster than any press release ever could. Clips from the tribute flooded timelines. The moment his voice cracked, the tear that slipped down his cheek, the words, "I miss my brother." For once, the headlines weren't about controversy or money. They were about emotion. Fans across generations shared the clip, calling it the most real thing Gene's ever done. Many admitted they'd never seen him so vulnerable. The same man who once strutted across stages, spitting fire, now trembling in front of a photo of his friend. On forums and fan pages, people began sharing their own memories of Ace, connecting their grief with Gene's. It wasn't celebrity mourning anymore. It felt collective. Music journalists praised the tribute as one of the most human moments in Kiss history. Even critics who had once accused Gene of being too business-minded said this changed everything. One article read, "For the first time, Gene Simmons didn't perform, he felt." Rock icons from other bands echoed the sentiment. Members of Metallica, Def Leppard, and Aerosmith posted tributes of their own, many quoting Gene's line, "We made a lot of noise together, but I didn't say enough when the lights were off." That sentence became a kind of mantra, a warning to appreciate people before it's too late. By the next morning, thousands of fans had posted one phrase under every Kiss video online: "Miss my brother." For a man who built his empire on volume, Gene's quietest moment had become his loudest echo. In the days after the tribute, Gene Simmons' emotional breakdown became more than a viral clip. It became a turning point. Fans weren't just talking about his tears, they were talking about what they meant. Because for the first time in decades, Gene wasn't speaking as the demon. He was speaking as a man who'd lost a piece of himself. He told friends later that Ace wasn't just a guitarist. He was the sound of our youth. Every riff, every mistake, every fight, It all built the chemistry that made Kiss legendary. And though the world saw them as icons, Gene saw them as brothers who started in a garage with nothing but noise, hope, and hunger. That's why the words, "I miss my brother," hit so hard. They weren't just about Ace Frehley. They were about the years they'd never get back. The chaos, the laughter, the wild joy of being young and unstoppable. It was an admission that no fame, no fortune, no reunion could ever fill the space left behind. Gene's grief also reframed the band's legacy. It reminded the world that Kiss wasn't just built on spectacle. It was built on four people who believed in each other enough to change music forever. And now, with Ace gone, that foundation feels more sacred and more fragile. Because when legends lose one of their own, the spotlight doesn't shine the same way. It flickers, like the last flame of a show that was never meant to end. As the lights dimmed on Ace Frehley's tribute, Gene Simmons remained seated long after the crowd began to leave. No words, no gestures, just quiet. The man who once filled arenas with fire and thunder was now just another mourner staring at a photo of someone he never thought he'd lose. Later, when asked why he chose to speak so softly that night, Gene said, "Because for the first time I didn't want to be loud. I just wanted to be honest." And that honesty has come to define his legacy far more than any stage show ever could. For 50 years, Kiss taught the world that rock could be bigger than life. But this moment reminded everyone that even rock gods bleed when their brothers are gone. Gene's tears didn't weaken the legend. They made it human. They made it real. And maybe that's why his final words, "I miss my brother," will echo longer than any lyric he's ever written. Because in the end, it wasn't about fame, fortune, or fire. It was about friendship, about two kids who dreamed the same dream, and one who had to finish it alone. What do you think? Did Gene's emotion make the world finally see who he really was beneath the demon? Like, if you believe strength isn't hiding the pain, it's feeling it. Subscribe for more stories that show the soul behind the spotlight.